There comes a moment in Dark Souls 2 where you forgive the game's indulgences, where you start to see the underlying themes of the game finally being reinforced by the sheer difficulty of it. Now, for me, that was when, after having heard so many stories of Dark Souls 1's difficulty, I've never played that game to completion. I've only played maybe 30 or 45 minutes of it, but I had heard stories of how difficult its bosses were. Now, after avoiding the first boss for as long as possible and just wandering around the area of the Forest of Fallen Giants and collecting all the items and secrets, fighting all the enemies, dying lots of times because this was my first playthrough, I finally mustered up the courage and stepped through the fog gate to face the last giant. What followed was not anticlimactic, but a demonstration of how far confidence and patience will get you in this game. After finally getting its health down to the point where it actually tore off its own arm to try and kill me, I finally stabbed the thing one last time, and it vanished into a cloud of particles. I had finally killed my first Dark Souls 2 boss. There will be many more to fall in the next couple hours of gameplay. Today's game industry is kind of weird. In a way, it's trying to recreate the old glories of the Nintendo Entertainment System, the SNES, the Genesis era, the arcade era of difficulty. Now, some might see that as going backwards, but for the longest time, and I can attest to this because the primary era of games that I grew up in was not full of particularly hard games, and games that were noted for their difficulty were almost had legendary status. Games like Ninja Gaiden on the Xbox, Devil May Cry, God of War, Gears of War. Those were difficult games, and they had a special status within the gaming community, some would call the hardcore segment of the gaming community. But over the past couple of years, and starting with Super Meat Boy, its release on the Xbox Live Arcade platform, difficulty started to come back into vogue in game design. Now, From Software released Demon's Souls, and then it released a game called Dark Souls. Now, Demon's Souls is not a game many people have played when you compare it to Dark Souls, which was a massive hit, a massive cult hit. It sold well over 1 million copies. And, of course, with Demon's Souls not being the success that From Software wanted, with Dark Souls, they had vindication for their design, for the specific design that they went for in that game, which was to make it hard, to make it unforgiving, to make it a brutal world. Now, I've seen videos analyzing every ounce of the game. Super Bunny Hop did an amazing video on Dark Souls, which made me rethink my approach to game difficulty when you factor it into a game's design in terms of how artistic the project really is. With that in mind, and with my position as sort of the Game of the Year tracker for 2-stash.com, I bought Dark Souls 2 a little over a month after release. What followed was 2 or 3 months of the most consuming process I've ever gone through while playing a video game. This game completely absorbed me in a way that almost no game has done in history. The only ones I can think of that compare to it, and ones that are certainly nowhere near as difficult as this game, are Skyrim, Halo Combat Evolved, and Fire Emblem. That puts it in illustrious company. What I went through in those 2 or 3 months where I obsessively played the game was, like I said, absorbing, but at the same time, one of the most frustrating, rewarding, and utterly insane games I've ever played in my life. There are moments in Dark Souls 2 where I wanted to break my television screen because of how difficult it was. And there are moments which vindicate the whole game which vindicate moments like those. There are certain sections of the game where I flat out didn't want to play them again when I made the rounds in New Game Plus. Places like Brightstone Cove Sildora, with its parasitic spiders, and me being an arachnophobe, being one of them. But there are also places where I flat out enjoyed the way the game was set up. Places like the Doors of Pharos, places like the Lost Bastille, the Forest of Fallen Giants, places like the Dragon Eyrie, or the Dragon Shrine. These are memorable locations, made all the more memorable by their inhabitants. Prepare to die was Dark Souls 1's motto. Prepare to die again was Dark Souls 2's motto. And I died so very many times due to the inhabitants of the levels that I fought through, but each death taught me something about myself, about my habits as a gamer, and it taught me patience as a person. I often go through life trying to rush things, and Dark Souls 2 taught me, at least in a just purely related to gameplay reasons, the folly of that kind of line of thinking. So I decided to take my time, and while there is no one single method to completely just breezing through the game, there are ways around the enemies and the difficulty spikes that you can manage that will make the game infinitely more enjoyable, I should say. Because if you get bogged down in an area, there's no way that you can say that the game is enjoyable at that point. But once you figure out the little tricks of the trade, once you figure out all the hidden locations of valuable items, the amount of frames that your weapons take to swing, the invincibility frames that you get from rolling, once you figure the game out, it opens up. Having gone through the game twice at the time of this recording, I can't even say that I've discovered half of the game's secrets, and I eagerly await the DLC that will be released for this game in the coming months. Dark Souls 2 is on my list, my short list for my favorite games of the year. In fact, if the awards were to be held right now, at the time of this recording, I would say that is de facto my game of the year. This is despite everything I've told you, where I would have moments where I want to smash my own Xbox 360 console into oblivion. This is an experience that will redefine your relationship with games if you aren't accustomed to sheer difficulty as a mantra in game design. Now, I should tell you a few stories about this game. There is a character in this game called the Emerald Herald, and she is a character who follows you throughout the game. She is, I guess I would say, a mentor to your journey. She will appear throughout the game in important moments, like you first discovering a really important moment in the plot or area in the plot. She will give her view of things, and encountering her throughout the game was incredibly rewarding because she kind of ties into another aspect of the game besides its difficulty, which makes the game appealing, and that's its world building. Dark Souls 2 doesn't build a world through expository dialogue. It builds it through information on the game's items. It builds it through the worlds that you have to fight through, the details in the world that make it a believable ruin of a civilization. The mood in Dark Souls 2 is one of perpetual gloom. The enemies you encounter throughout the game are all zombified, are all ruined enemies. The entire game world is full of crumbling ruins. I know I've said the word ruins a lot, but that's the best way to describe it. This whole game, this whole experience, this game world is fractured, shattered, and you are battling through the remnants of the civilization that used to thrive. It doesn't build it, like I said, through expository dialogue, like, this is our world, and this is your place within it. It throws you into the world, and you have to navigate your way through it. You will face enemies that fit within the themes of each level that you visit. You will face bosses which, after you fight them, make incredible sense. You will pick up items which have little blurbs of lore attached to them, and you will slowly unravel the mystery that is Drang Lake, which is the name of the world that Dark Souls 2 takes place on. This is an aspect of Dark Souls 2 which doesn't get enough credit in my eyes. One of the best games I ever played fails of lore building because it relies a lot on expository dialogue, a lot on the game forcing a lot of information down your throat instead of letting you explore the world and find things out on your own. And that is Skyrim, which, as I said before, is one of my favorite games of all time, or one of the games I'm most been absorbed by, which is equivalent to being one of my favorite games of all time, either way you slice it. Now, Dark Souls 2 is exemplary in the way of show, don't tell, that a lot of movies, a lot of television shows, a lot of games have failed at, but Dark Souls 2 absolutely succeeds in implementing that mantra. The moment of sheer excitement I got from beating a couple of bosses in this game and unlocking a new area to explore is almost unrivaled by any other game I've ever played in my life. Not just because of the amount of punishment I had to overcome in order to attain that opening up of the world, but because I was very much interested in what the rest of the world was like. Now, as I say this, I know very well that there, like I said, are very few areas where I actually like going to, like Brightstone Cave, Sildora, the Black Gulch, the Gutter. Those are 3 areas I could do without in this game. Not because they don't essentially fit into the lore, it's because they're full of annoying kind of like enemies and the way the levels are structured within those areas. The Gutter has complete blackness, complete darkness, which you have to navigate, and I can understand that to an extent, but it's also slightly annoying. The Black Gulch has these poison spitting statues, which are completely annoying as hell, and it has the Rotten, which I consider one of the most annoying bosses in the game, and then Brightstone Cove Sildora has those spiders, which I so very much hate. You can look at my the Dark Souls 2 Let's Play that I put on my channel if you want to understand my reaction to these things. But the rest of the game has absolutely absorbing levels. The Lost Bastille is one. The Dragon Area, with its sheer graphical and artistic beauty, even on the Xbox 360, which is the version I played. The Dragon Shrine, you have the Shrine of Amana, which is this swamp which is overcoming, I should say, the ruins of the shrine. And it's filled with these absolutely corrosive creatures, which could partially explain how the shrine was overcome by this swamp. You have the Forest of Fallen Giants with its absolutely stunning shattered castle, which you actually play through the rejuvenated version of it during some of these giant memories that you'll have to complete in order to complete the game. There are some stunning places in this world. Majula, the hub world, is another one, because every character you meet, or most of the characters you meet, will eventually gravitate towards that area. And the conversations they provide, the lore that is built up with these characters, and the sheer fact that Majula is connected in some way to almost every single one of the major areas in the game by itself, just makes it a special location to me. Now, Dark Souls 2, being a role-playing game, has a lot of flexibility in the way you can build your character in order to match the game's many challenges. I started out as a melee character, and I still am in my second run through a melee character. So in comparison to the sorcerer class, which you can also choose, or a cleric class, any magic-based class really, you are at a disadvantage. Because having played a huge chunk of the game with a sorcerer build, I can safely say that they have an easier time at this game, simply because they can reliably pepper away at enemies without having to brave their attacks at close range. And most of the enemies in this game are close range powerhouses. They will murder you in 2 or 3 hits. They have very definable patterns that you must learn in order to surmount them as a challenge. But as a melee character, this game is punishing to a degree which no game had been before to me. I had played games like Super Meat Boy that adapted to its platforming difficulty. The hardest game I ever played in my life was Halo 2 on Legendary difficulty, and we all know what a cluster that game was with its insta-killing snipers. And just imagine those snipers on every single level of the game, and you can imagine what Dark Souls 2 is like. So I focused on swordsmanship on the first run-through, and I succeeded. Swords and bows, a great combination for getting through many of the game's challenges. Having a good shield helps. But what I found about this game is its flexibility doesn't mean that you'll become this uber powerful character. You still, despite the amount of health that you have, despite all the stats you put into endurance or vitality or strength, attack power, you still have to overcome these enemies through the traditional way, and they're not easy. Even in later game builds, the early game enemies will still kill you in 2 or 3 hits, or 2 or 3 or 4 if you're not careful, if you're not paying attention enough. That's what this game is about, and that's what I think attracts me to it, despite many levels of, shall I say, bull that you'll encounter throughout the game. There are some enemies in the game which can completely catch you off guard, even if you're paying attention, but those usually come in New Game Plus. I'm not one of those people who found that the game's end game was lacking. I found it a perfect build-up to surmounting the obstacles of the world and finding your place within it, which was, after you've gone through the stuff you've gone through as a character, you deserve that throne, okay? You deserve to become the king of this realm, as the story will very much make you. I've finally surmounted the final boss, Nashandra, after having gone through King Vendrick, the Rat King Covenant, after having gone through the Belfry Gargoyles, and the people who guard the belfries, the Old Iron King, the Lost Sinner, the Rotten, the Deer Duke's Dear Frisia, or Freya. I'd gone through some incredibly tough mofos to get to this one last boss, and surmounting or beating that boss lifted the pressure off of me for once, and I felt elation, like I said earlier, in a way that has barely been matched by any other game. Now, New Game Plus is an entirely different beast. The enemies get insanely tough, and the game will even, in a slight dick move, throw in even more enemies. And you can tell that they're new because they're bathed in a red aura, and these enemies hit like a truck and have the HP to match. This is how Dark Souls 2 works. It's oppressively difficult, oppressively gloomy, and impressively life-affirming, because it teaches you to value every second you have as a human being while in the world. There are still some aspects of the game which I'd rather not have to deal with. The random invasions of other players that can occur every now and then, I wouldn't have a problem with them if every single player I've ever encountered has not lagged to the point where they have a clear advantage over me, or they have powerful weaponry, which I had either not discovered nor been able to fully utilize due to the lag. Out of the 30 or so invasions I've encountered throughout the game from other players, I've only managed to win 3 of them, and I could stand these invasions if the equipment levels were similar, and if magic wasn't so completely overpowered in player versus player situations. You will be destroyed by magic-wielding players. You'll be destroyed by people who just teleport behind you and backstab you, and this is an aspect of the game which I think needs some work. One of the amazing elements of this game, in relation to the online play, is the fact that you can summon other players to help you, and I've had some of the most rewarding experiences of my gaming life playing with other people to surmount the enemies and bosses in every level. I have soloed a lot of the game, but it's funner with other people, and I would often leave summon signs myself so I could be summoned to help other people. But even that has problems. The way the game is implemented, this online play aspect, this co-op aspect, is it has this concept called soul memory. Now, soul memory basically divides summonable players into tiers, and unfortunately, this is to the game's detriment. Now, I completely understand, maybe perhaps not allowing higher level characters with insane weaponry to just allow themselves to be summoned by a person who is just starting the game out. I could understand that to a certain extent, but Dark Souls 2 has, it seems like, 40 plus tiers of summonable people, and the summon items you have at your disposal will only let you summon a few tiers up and a few tiers down of where your soul memory is. So in instances where you actually want to be summoned by other people or you want to help out other players, you're handicapped by the fact that you're stuck within a very narrow range of summonable players that want your help or you want to help. That is one of the weaknesses of Dark Souls 2. And despite everything I've said about how much elation I felt of overcoming its difficulty, it's hard to deny that Dark Souls 2 has a level of difficulty that will simply turn away lots of people. People who aren't anywhere near prepared for the difficulty will not like this game. This game will punish you for the slightest mistakes, and it will tell you that that's the point of it. After all, the motto of this game was prepare to die again. Now, Dark Souls 2 is, of course, like I said earlier, very old school in its design. I heard one memorable comparison made to Castlevania. One person, Gabriel Morton, Yahtzee Crowshaw's Let's Play partner, called it the best 3D Castlevania game ever made. He was referring to Dark Souls 1, of course, but the same thing could probably be applied to Dark Souls 2. And I can totally see the relationship. You have to analyze your animations, the enemy's animations, and work around them. The world is full of hidden items and collectibles. The difficulty is oppressive, but the one thing I'm thankful for is that there are no platforming segments in this game. The game would be unplayable if that were the case, because the jump controls in this game are, quite frankly, horrible. But here we are, or here I am, having just completed twice the most difficult game I've ever played, and I want more. Despite all the flaws I've revealed to you, despite the insane amounts of frustration I've had with this game, particularly if you factor in the player versus player elements, I still want to play more of it. That is my recommendation to you for Dark Souls 2.